Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Presser Law Firm, where your asset protection attorneys are here to help you protect all your assets. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. We're excited to get going. Our topic for today is going to be on international asset protection. Many times we probably have watched movies where we hear people have money overseas or assets overseas. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So I hope you're excited and have your notepads ready to take on some notes. Let's get going. The goal of today's webinar is to discuss a few things. Now, we're going to be talking about a couple different things. We're only going to cover a few things regarding international asset protection. We want to focus on what is international asset protection, why international asset protection, the importance about it, is international asset protection legal, the different forms of international asset protection, and domestic versus international asset protection. So what is international asset protection? International asset protection, in short, IAP, is a wealth protection strategy that essentially focuses on protecting your assets through means outside of the United States. We're talking about foreign jurisdictions. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but contrary to popular belief, it is very legal to protect your money outside of the United States. And it's legal to own and invest in foreign assets in order to grow your wealth and protect it from American creditors or lawsuits. Similar to domestic asset protection, there are different ways, different mechanisms, within international asset protection that can be used to protect your valuables and wealth. There are options that we're going to talk about today, some of which are LLCs, limited liability companies, Cook Island LLCs, international trusts, captive insurance companies, international asset protection trusts, and offshore equity stripping. These mechanisms, they're very similar to the ones we find in domestic asset protections, but they differ in that they do not take place domestically. They don't take place in the US. They come with their own set of rules, like reporting specific information to the IRS and making sure that you're paying the applicable US taxes on foreign income. This process and the rules can be complicated. So to better understand the ins and outs of tax responsibilities, foreign assets, and international protections, we're always going to recommend that you reach out to our international asset protection attorneys here at our firm to talk more in detail. So why international asset protection? There are many reasons why international asset protection is so effective. One reason, for example, is that IAP centers don't enforce US domestic judgment or judicial or administrative orders. Essentially, what that means is that it's very difficult to enforce a judgment from the US overseas. You thus gain jurisdictional immunity. So the best way I can explain this, as you can see in the picture we have here, if you ever played street basketball, whenever you're about to start a game or do a pickup game, if you're playing with an opponent one-on-one, two-on-two, you see this line here, the three-point line has to be respected. As you're serving the ball and you're crossing it across the lines before the game actually starts, your opponent has to stay within the three-point line before the ball can even be served. And that's essentially how domestic and international asset protection work with one another. When it comes to US judgments, it's very difficult for creditors to go overseas and to enforce those judgments. There are countries that won't even enforce those decrees at all. So which is why we like to use these countries for asset protection. And since these countries don't recognize American judgments or civil decrees, most of the time the creditor would have to relitigate that case within the international jurisdiction. And for that reason, it can be very costly, it can be very difficult, or sometimes even impractical or impossible for the creditor to do it. For instance, there will be times where the statute of limitations may have expired, or the country may not recognize the type of liability which is the basis for the lawsuit. These countries, they also impose procedural obstacles to effectively blockade creditors in litigation. Asset protection jurisdictions are debtor friendly. They're in business to protect their consumers' wealth. Wealth protection is what they sell, like the Cook Islands. Our firm here, we work a lot with clients who utilize the Cook Islands for international asset protection. These countries, they do it very, very well. I want you to understand through our conversation today that asset protection jurisdictions, they make their protective entities even more protective than other countries. International asset protection trusts, LLCs, limited partnership foundations, captive insurance companies, international business companies, even hybrid companies and various other entities, each provide better protection than most US entities. It's arguably said that international asset protection is the best defensive form of protecting your wealth and your assets. And this is why very few judgment creditors recover a defendant's international wealth. Without their international protection, many debtors would undoubtedly have lost their wealth. So we started off by asking the question, or by proposing the preface, that is international asset protection legal? It's a myth that's out there. And our answer to that, though it may sound legal, it depends, right? There's three things we want you to consider when you're questioning whether the way you're structuring and the way you're setting up your international asset protection, if it's legal. Number one, how are you structuring your assets overseas? Number two, how are you reporting the income and the revenue those assets are gaining? And number three, do you have the right team to assist you in making sure in the process of setting everything up is done properly? Contrary to popular belief, it's perfectly legal to invest and protect your money internationally. It's not that difficult, nor is it unsafe, but you have to do it correctly. For instance, you must comply with IRS reporting requirements, and you have to make sure you pay the taxes on your international earnings. Uncle Sam is always watching you. You want to go international either for creditor protection or to invest. You don't go international just to save money on taxes. It's not a tax deferring strategy. Most international protective arrangements are tax neutral, or they won't either reduce your taxes nor defer, nor sometimes they won't even increase your taxes. So understand very well that when it comes to international asset protection, it's not a tax avoidance strategy, but it's a way to provide the protection and the privacy that you need. As Uncle Sam is pointing at you in the picture down there, you always have to tell Uncle Sam what's going on. You get the best protection when your assets are international for several reasons. So, in continuance of whether it's legal or not, I want you to understand that international asset protection can be coupled with domestic asset protection. In today's society, it's gaining more and more popularity, especially the fact that we're in a very litigious society where there's lawsuits being filed on every day for different reasons. And at the end of the day, what's the best way to settle a lawsuit is through your wealth, right? Through your money. I want you to understand that international asset protection is definitely legal. We've been using it for a very, very long time at our firm here, ever since the firm began, and helping our clients set up the different entities based on their goals and what they're trying to achieve in their asset protection internationally. So let's talk a little bit about the different forms of international asset protection. International Asset Protection Trust. The IAP trust is an asset protection form that allows assets to remain safe from creditor attacks. Think of a trust as a legal management device, right? And what does it manage? It manages whatever asset you put inside of the trust. Though different from entities such as limited liability companies, corporations, or partnership, a trust, it carries many of the benefits provided by an entity you would normally form with the filing of the proper documents with the Secretary of State. A trust involves different parties, and the goal of those parties is to manage those assets within the trust for the benefit of the beneficiary. The beneficiary are the people who are designated to receive the assets of the trust at a specified point in time. The individual who sets up the trust, we call them the settlor or grantor. The individuals who are appointed to care for the property that is funded into the trust, we call them the trustees. There's also another party that we call the protector, the trust protector, and this is an individual designated to be the neutral party between the trustee and the beneficiaries. The protector, their job is to often act as, I would say, the check and balances system to ensure that the assets are kept safe for the beneficiaries. The International Asset Protection LLC, limited liability company. Very similar to a domestic LLC. This one allows for individuals to set up these corporations or these companies overseas with the benefit of being able to manage their assets in an entity. So in the US and domestically, if you were forming an LLC, depending on the state that you're in, you would obtain the proper formation documents in that state. You would fill those out and then you would file it with the Secretary of State. Internationally, it's very similar in that regards, except you're doing it overseas. The International Limited Liability Company also has managers similar to domestic LLC and also has members. Be mindful that in LLC, you'll hear of two different type of parties involved in an LLC. You'll have the managers, you'll have the members. The members are essentially the owners of the, they own the LLC, they control all the assets of the LLC. It's for their benefit, right? The profits, the gains, the losses all go towards the member. The manager, on the other end, is not the owner of the LLC, but they're placed in a position where they actually manage the day-to-day operations of the LLC, okay? The LLC is a very good alternative to the trust. And why? This is because it allows for enhanced flexibility in the management structuring, and it also allows for privacy. The trust gives you the privacy, but it doesn't give you as much flexibility as the LLC. With the LLC, you can elect to either be member managed or manager managed, right? And whichever option you elect, you control what happens to that LLC on a day-to-day. Whereas with the trust, you're limited to the trust agreement, right? And the only person who really has the right to do anything on behalf of the trust would be the trustee. Now, the benefits of international asset protection, as we said before, it's the most defensive way you can protect your assets internationally. While domestic offers really great options and really great protection, international asset protection, it can offer you even more. We typically say if someone is around the high net worth more than approximately, let's say 500,000, you should definitely consider international protective strategy. And there are many benefits that come with that, as we've discussed before, but ultimately the goal here is to protect you from creditors, avoidance of fraudulent transfers, and potentially tax benefits. A couple of things to consider when we're looking at the international asset protection, right? As we mentioned before, first off, the foreign jurisdictions, they do not recognize or enforce US judgments. So let's break this down just a little bit, right? So this means if I have a lawsuit, hypothetically, let's say in Florida, and I have offshore assets in the Cook Islands, as we mentioned before, the creditor who's ensuing me in the state of Florida, even if they were to win a judgment, in order to collect on my international assets, they would have to either go to the Cook Islands or to refile that lawsuit, or they would have to find another manner of getting access to those assets. So it's really, really, really difficult in order for this to happen. And we would say 9 out of 10 times, the domestic judgments, the domestic creditors, they don't pursue foreign assets. Statistics shows that fewer 3 out of 100 judgment creditors even attempt to recover international wealth, okay? Another benefit is that international protection puts you in a better negotiating position in case of lawsuits. So let's go back to the example that we just talked about. The process of creditors obtaining the offshore wealth is very lengthy and it's very costly, right? As we mentioned before, if you consider the statute of limitations to refile in that foreign jurisdiction, the statute of limitations may have passed. And just for those of you who don't know what statute of limitations is, So with every lawsuit, with every claim, there's a time period from when the claim arises that you have to, I guess, go after it in the court of law. And if you don't go after it within that time period, you essentially lose your day in court. You use the ability to bring up the claim. So with that being said, if you have international assets and a creditor was to win a domestic judgment against you, maybe the time period for them to go to first off, they have to locate your assets overseas. And then second off, for them to go and file the claim, if they're licensed in the US, that doesn't automatically give them the ability to file a suit internationally. They would have to find out the laws of that country and find an attorney locally there who they can essentially outsource that case. So as you can see, it can become very lengthy and very costly in order to take that judgment and go and enforce it internationally. So if you consider combining your international protection with domestic protection, it allows you to essentially rest knowing that one lawsuit won't wipe you out. And as we discussed before, depending on your goals, depending on your net worth, you may want to consider moving some of your money that you're not utilizing or assets that you're not necessarily utilizing it overseas. Now, what type of form are you going to use? If it's a trust or an LLC, that's really dependent on your goals, dependent on what assets are you working with, and dependent on where you currently are in your life. So through discussion with our attorneys, we would be able to help you and guide you as to what's the best strategy and best way for you. So consider, and summarizing this little section here, that the additional protection, it's important for you to consider, especially for high-risk professions such as healthcare professionals. With these assets offshore, you can potentially avoid fraudulent transfer. Fraudulent transfer, for those of you who don't understand, is one that is made with actual intent to hinder, delay, or defraud any creditor of the debtor. An example of a fraudulent transfer would be transferring a large sum of your wealth into another person's account at the moment you're sued, right? So a claim is filed against you, you receive service, that a claim's been filed against you, and all of a sudden you decide to transfer $1 million to a brother or sister or a friend of yours. However, if you transfer it to an offshore account, US creditors will not be able to access it, right? So international jurisdictions, again, they don't recognize fraudulent transfers. Therefore, this leaves you with more protection. And last but not least, in this conversation of the different forms of international asset protection, there's also a potential to save on taxes when you safeguard your wealth overseas. While, again, you always have to report everything to Uncle Sam. So you need to report to the IRS the amount of money you have in your international accounts, and you have to pay taxes on any gains. Some people, they utilize the IAP for protection, while others utilize it for investments, as you always see in the movies that we watch, right? However, you still will be taxed on any money you take out of your offshore account and transfer to the US. So therefore, you'll receive tax benefits by keeping a part of your wealth in an international jurisdiction, okay? The statutes of each international location are what makes it so protective. In fact, at our firm here, we have helped rewrite some of the asset protection laws for these foreign jurisdictions. Popular choices of international jurisdictions, just for some of you who want to know, you got the Cook Islands, you have the Cayman Islands, you got Belize, and you got the Bahamas. Okay, the most popular ones for us are Nevis and the Cook Islands. In our view, they're two of the most protective jurisdictions. So let's take a moment now to talk a little bit about the comparison between the domestic and international asset protection, which we've touched upon a lot of points there, but we want to consider three things. Number one, we want to consider the cost. Number two, we want to consider the location. And number three, you want to consider your personal goals. Determining whether you need domestic or international asset protection, or both, depends entirely on the type of assets you have and the level of protection you are looking for and the amount of money you are willing to spend on protecting your assets. I mean, this can run you from anywhere from a couple $1,000s to a lot of close to $100,000, depending on the amount of assets you have and how much money and the level of protection that you're aiming for. So the decision of where to protect your assets ultimately comes down to what you and your asset protection attorney deem is best for your assets. So you reach out to us and you tell us what your goals are and what your needs are. And from there, we can kind of direct you to what country you believe would be the best place, what geographic location would be the best place for you. But even there are still many different factors that you must take into account when making these decisions. So let's first pick out the location. Okay, so regardless of whether you choose domestic or an international asset protection, you will want to pick a jurisdiction that has the best asset protection laws, right? Laws that would provide you with some either maybe privacy, right? So while both domestic and international asset protection provide excellent protection for your assets, having a foreign plan will enhance the level of privacy you are afforded compared to having a domestic asset protection plan. One of the things about the location will be the governing law. Often viewed as simpler when viewed from a legal standpoint because you're working with laws that you are usually already familiar with when you talk about domestically. But when you go internationally, assets are set up with an offshore country, meaning your assets will be governed by that country's foreign laws, rules, and regulations. One of the perks of foreign asset protection, is that countries like, let's say, like Belize and the Cook Islands, they don't acknowledge the US judgments. So whereas before we gave you an extensive list of different countries that are typically considered for international asset protection, we definitely have to consider the governing laws, again, based on the type of assets that you're protecting. So due to this fact, these countries would not enforce US judgments in favor of a creditor. And I'm referring to Belize and the Cook Islands. And the last thing we want to look at again is the cost. A domestic plan is typically less expensive than creating and maintaining an international asset protection plan. So just to give you an overview, domestically, you're looking at the cost of creating the entity, the cost of hiring your registered agent, and the cost of paying your renewal fees every year, right? So when you create an entity in the US, depending on the state, you have to pay a renewal fee for that entity every year. That can range from $100 to, I think we've seen some states up to $300 to $400 every year that you're paying for that entity that you're creating. Now, when it comes to international, you're not only paying those same fees, but you're also paying those international fees that are associated with it, which can cost you really, really more money. All right. So with all that being said, for the safest protection, you should keep a portion of your assets international. And this is very important for us to understand because this is something that's been in our system for a very long time. Part of international wealth planning has been popular for over 2,000 years. Originating from Roman emperors who relocated their fortunes to international lands to preserve their riches for their descendants, right? If you think about asset protection, it's not just protecting it for you, but it's protecting it for your heirs. It's protecting it for your children and your family. What you don't want is, one circumstance or one situation to occur, one lawsuit to ensue, and you're in a position now where all your assets are being foreclosed or all your assets are being taken away from you. So it's very important that you consider not just the international asset protection, but even the domestic asset protection. However, the international protection, it's way more protective than the domestic protection. It's very popular today, primarily because of our lawsuit explosion in the US. As we said, lawsuits are being filed every day. I would arguably say maybe at every second of the day, there's a new lawsuit being filed with a court. But trillions of people are now protected in various international financial centers to protect their wealth, especially those who are of high net worth and those who have some assets or liquid that they believe that's not necessary for them to keep it domestically. They move it overseas, they move it internationally. So each year here, we find that Americans, they're seeking international asset protection and international investing opportunities. They realize that going international can be the safest place for their money, especially in these unsafe times. If anything, COVID has taught us is more lawsuits peaked, the filing of lawsuits peaked during and after COVID than before. Unfortunately, it's important to consider asset protection. I mean, it's not something you consider after the fact, but you have to be proactive on top of it and consider it at every step of the way. As you're earning money, as you're earning more assets and your wealth is growing, you want to consider asset protection planning in your wealth strategy. So with that being said, we want to thank everybody for joining our webinar today. We want to give you the opportunity to reach out to us if you have any questions. You can always schedule the Presser Law Firm for a speaking engagement or for a webinar. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter. You can request copies of our asset protection books written by attorney Hillel Presser, or you can even schedule a complimentary preliminary consultation with our firm. So we want to thank everybody for watching. We want to thank you for your time. Be sure to connect with us and stay tuned to our future webinars and blogs. Have a good one.